Kerry George with CIBN TV, and today I'm sitting here with Bill Stemp from Stemp Company. Bill, how long have you been practicing law in Calgary here?
43 years.
43 years. How many businesses have you helped over 43 years?
It would be in the thousands, I would guess.
Thousands of businesses. So you've been around, you've seen a lot.
Yes.
So can you tell us, what are some of the ways that businesses get into trouble with things like trademarking and patenting and some of the things that you cover?
The client could be, or business could be using a trademark that is owned by somebody else without knowing that. They could be inadvertently using the trademark. When you incorporate a company, you have to do a new search, but if you're a sole proprietor or a partnership, you don't go through that process. And so you could be using a name that's very similar or identical to an existing company or existing trademark, and you can put a lot of money into signage and to letterhead and invoices and so on, and then find out a year or two later that you can't use that name because it's a registered trademark owned by somebody else, and you get a letter demanding that you change the name within 1 or 2 months, and then you've got to change the name. So then you lose all that goodwill that you've built up in the meantime.
Right. How often does that happen?
More often than you would like to know. Yeah, it
Wow.
happens. It happens a lot. Yeah.
Wow. So when you first get started in business, you need to go through the right process and check these things out.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So what other types of problems do businesses get into in the legal realm like that?
Are you talking in terms of economics, like
Sure.
finances, or
Yeah.
if you're extending credit to customers or clients too quickly, you can run into problems with payments. You should get a good deposit down when you start work on something. If you don't do that, you may run into a problem with the client or the customer paying you. The customer or client may end up going into insolvency without you being aware of that in the first place, and you've got a problem then with an outstanding account, especially if you're incurring a lot of cost for labor or raw materials, for example, and you don't have any money up front from the client. You may have a problem getting paid, and you may be out that money.
Do you help with those kinds of problems as well?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, what happens if you get running a business and along comes somebody and they try to sue you? They try to, they say you owe them something, or they got hurt on the workplace or something like this. What are the next steps? How does that go down?
In Alberta, there is workers' compensation legislation, so if you're injured at work, there is no possibility of suing the employer. You have to apply through WCB, and you get compensated that way. If you are injured as a result of the negligence of a third party, not your employer, you and the employer can then sue to get some compensation, but again, it's got to go through WCB to do that. WCB would be able to be part of that group so they can get reimbursed for whatever they've paid the injured worker.
When someone's getting started in business, are there some things that they should be watching out for as they're setting up their business to make sure that they're doing the right steps and they can prevent some of these problems from happening in the future? Yeah,
if you've got some partners involved, you need to have an agreement in terms of what happens if one of those shareholders or partners, whether it's incorporated or not incorporated, if one of those shareholders decides to back away from the business, they're working 5 days a week and they decide they would rather work 2 or 3 days a week, well, what happens to the salary of that person? Do their shares change? Should the amount of dividends be reduced that they're receiving? Or what happens if they decide to move away? Somebody moves to Vancouver, for example, and they're no longer able to look after the business or to put their attention to the business. There needs to be a fixed agreement, written agreement in place to buy the shares or the interest, if it's a partnership, of that person, and you need to have a good solid agreement in place to prevent a dispute later on between the shareholders or the partners.
What happens with these agreements where people say, well, we just had a handshake agreement?
It's no agreement at all. You have the person selling or leaving wants obviously as much money as they can get, and the person staying wants to pay as little money as they can, and there's always then a dispute. You also have a big problem if one of the partners or shareholders should pass away or become disabled, not able to work, then you've got to be able to, if they've passed away, you have to be able to buy the shares or the partnership interest of that person from the estate And if you have a life insurance policy to fund that, then it may be all right, but the life insurance policy has to be at least enough to cover what the obligation is under the buy-sell agreement, or what's now called the unanimous shareholders agreement. If you have no life insurance, then you're legally required to buy out the interest of that deceased shareholder, for example, but there may be no cash to be able to do that.
What happens if there's now there's a wife involved? You had two guys that are in business together and one passed away. Are they now doing business with the wife?
They are. The wife, the spouse, is usually the beneficiary of the deceased shareholder, so they become the executor and maybe the only or the primary beneficiary of that person. So now you're dealing with the estate of the deceased shareholder, and the estate's controlled by the spouse, whether it's a husband or wife, and now you're dealing with the spouse of your partner, whether you want to do that or not. You have to deal, or your partnership now is with that spouse of the partner.
So it's really important that you not only do things like check, your name and set up the things properly, but you also have to work with your partner, if you got a business partner, and get life insurance and get a buy-sell agreement in place so that there's nothing left unanswered in case of these kinds of problems.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, there's only one thing that's certain in life, and that's that we're going to die, so you should be planning for that, right? You'd think. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that with us today. I think that gives us some ideas of some of the things we need to look out for, and we appreciate your time here, Bill.
You're welcome.